dinner. We'll begin the program by having Brandon Doe read the City Council resolution, which was passed earlier today, honoring Mahatma Gandhi.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here in the presence of you all today, and especially in the presence of Reverend James Lawson. Recognizing October 2nd, 2019 as the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mahatma Gandhi, and calling upon all Philadelphians to honor the legacy of Gandhi in the month of October and unite in mutual love to achieve peace and justice. Whereas October 2nd, 2019 marks the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi brought life and movement to an India that was suffocated under colonial rule and choked by ancient and decaying structures and ideas. And whereas Gandhi was a political genius that saw the masses of the people as the makers of history and the agents of change. He went to the vast Indian peasantry, lived among them, lived as they lived, and learned from them. Thus, they grew to trust him in ways that few leaders in history have been trusted. And whereas Gandhi based his struggles on the concept of ahimsa, nonviolence, and satyagraha, insistence on the truth or truth force. These were ancient concepts drawn from Jain and Hindu traditions and can be found in one form or another in all religious traditions. They uphold the concept that all human life has virtue and that truth and hence freedom can be reached. Gandhi converted these concepts into a concrete social force. He put into practice a strategy for collective liberation through resistance to evil. And whereas the freedom of India and the defeat of the British Empire spiraled into a worldwide anti-colonial and anti-racist struggle. It inspired the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. It inspired the Black freedom struggle in America as part of the worldwide struggle against racial oppression. And whereas in celebrating Gandhi, we also celebrate Martin Luther King Jr., the greatest interpreter of Gandhi. Martin Luther King Jr. showed that nonviolent resistance is an act of extreme courage. He showed that love can be a powerful social force capable of changing society. And whereas Gandhi's legacy teaches us how to stand for peace, justice, love, and truth, and how to believe in the oneness of humanity and fight for unity in the midst of evil systems and ideologies that work to divide us. Long live Gandhi and the struggle for peace and freedom. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Council of the City of Philadelphia hereby recognizes October 2nd, 2019 as the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mahatma Gandhi, and calling upon all Philadelphians to honor the legacy of Gandhi in the month of October and unite in mutual love to achieve peace and justice. Further resolved that an engrossed copy of this resolution be made as a sincere expression of the Council of the City of Philadelphia's gratitude, admiration, and recognition.
We're also very fortunate today to have messages of solidarity from Gandhian and peace forces from around the world joining us in commemorating today as Gandhi's 150th birthday. The first message is a written message from Raj Mohan Gandhi, who is one of the grandsons of Mahatma Gandhi, and in his own right is a historian and scholar at the University of Illinois, who's done a great deal of research on the relationship of Gandhi and King. So Raj Mohan Gandhi writes, "One of the most hope-giving things in the 20th century was the solidarity between struggles for freedom from colonial rule in Asia and Africa on the one hand, and the battle for civil rights in the US on the other. Thousands of miles away from the U.S., many women and men in India rooted for the success of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s marches and of campaigns in American cities against discriminatory laws. In the U.S., African American activists drew strength from India's independence struggle. In a letter he wrote on July 1st, 1942, Mahatma Gandhi told President Franklin Delano Roosevelt that the Allies' World War II declaration that they were fighting for democracy and individual freedom sounded, quote, hollow, as long as African Americans continued to suffer in the U.S., and as long as freedom for European colonies in Asia and Africa was withheld. Today, almost 8 decades later, a number of countries hear open calls for so-called rightful owners to protect their nations from racial and religious minorities, and for a reversal of laws and programs that were bringing belated justice to disadvantaged groups. In the US, India, and elsewhere, aggressive nationalism has become a convenient cloak for promoting hate and coercive policies against minorities and the deprived. As the unique city of Philadelphia marks the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi's birth, with Reverend James Lawson, that exceptional historical and living figure, blessing and inspiring those gathered, allow me to send an earnest plea. May proud inheritors of the legacies of the American Civil Rights Movement and of India's independence struggle join hands to meet today's serious threats to hard-won equality, hard-won independence, and world peace. With salutations and in solidarity, Raj Mohan Gandhi. Next, we will share with you a video message from Mr. E.S. Reddy, who is the former director of the UN Special Committee Against Apartheid, and also a researcher and scholar who's written a great deal on Gandhi. Earlier today, he was given a citation at City Hall by the City Council of Philadelphia as part of the celebrations commemorating Gandhi's 150th.
So I'm very glad your association is observing the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. In many cities in America, there are statues of Gandhi, associated with Gandhi, university courses and Gandhi. They're promoted by the Indian cities. But there seems to be none in some places. I hope that the makers that because it has much in America. He never visited America. But there are many admirers in America. We have numerous Americans. Whenever they went to India, they went to see Gandhi, they had interviews with Gandhi. I'm just completing a manuscript. We just completed, in fact, a manuscript on Gandhi's interviews to Americans. It's over 400 pages of the interviews that recorded. The total number of interviews, of course, was much greater. And that book is with the publishers and it will probably be published in the next few months. But also I was very aware of the cost of America, especially the oppression of the Negro people, and we spoke about it very often. And there was solidarity because Indians were oppressed in South Africa and in India. In 1942, he wrote a letter to President Roosevelt asking for his understanding of his demand, written to withdraw from India when we were in the war. And during that letter, asking for help from Roosevelt, he mentioned the bigger problem in the United States. So he was quite frank about it. So this is something that the United States should know as they develop a greater interest in Gandhi. In fact, there has been a greater interest in Gandhi around the world ever since he died. I don't think there's any parallel except in the case of religious leaders. So that's all I would like to say at this stage to come, but I would like to congratulate you again on observing the 150th anniversary of Gandhi. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed that message from Mr. E.S. Reddy. We're going to go now into a special conversation between Reverend James Lawson. A little bit about Reverend Lawson for those joining us now. He was our special guest at City Hall today. He is a leader of the Black Freedom Movement. He studied Gandhian nonviolence in India in the 50s. When he came back to the United States, he went to Nashville on the urging of Dr. King, where he led nonviolent workshops training activists desegregating downtown Nashville. He worked closely with Dr. King, and he was the one who invited Dr. King to Memphis at the time of the sanitation workers' strike, and which was the occasion on which Dr. King was soon after assassinated. And in the years since, he's been a longtime fighter for peace and justice. He'll be speaking tonight with Ms. Zakia Ali, who's a longtime activist in Philadelphia, and with Untitled Chapter, who's a young member of the Saturday Free School and an activist from India.
Would Zakia like to come up, please? Oh.
Sorry, he's gonna go grab it.
We're going to wait 2 minutes so she can come back, and then we'll begin. Okay, we're going to get started, and then Zakia can join us when she gets here. So I think Reverend Lawson has already had an introduction today, maybe 3 times over. And I know he introduces himself also, so I'm not going to introduce him. And with the way we had planned this was I would ask him a few questions and he would answer them, and then we can all have a conversation together, everybody in the audience as well. So Reverend, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is something that we've been discovering over the year of the course of Gandhi, as we've been studying this history of exchange between African Americans and Indians, we've been coming across these figures like Howard Thurman, Sue Bailey Thurman, Mordecai Johnson, who visited India and brought back the philosophy of nonviolence after studying the movement of Gandhi. So I wanted to know from you why you chose to go to India, and what was it there that either convinced you that nonviolence was the way, or reaffirmed it for you, either case.
I want to propose to you something as an alternative way of looking at Martin King's nonviolent emergence and at my own. Because the theories and methodologies and the philosophies and also the theologies behind nonviolence are older than the term nonviolence. I hope you heard what I said. The philosophies, the methods, tactics, the theologies, philosophies, the political theories behind nonviolence, well, that caused nonviolence to emerge, those ideas are very, very ancient ideas. They're in the literature of the past. They're in the Hebrew Bible and what you could also call the Christian Bible, for example. They're in the Quran. They're in the teachings of Confucius and Mozi of China. They're in the teachings of the Buddha. So Gandhi did not call himself the discoverer or inventor of nonviolence. I call him the father of nonviolence in the 20th and 21st century, because like an Einstein or like a Thomas Edison, he pulled together a range of thought and understandings and summarized them in like an equation, like the law of gravity equation. He summarized it: nonviolence, soul force, truth force, all terms that Gandhi used. Satyagraha, a word that he invented along with help from the readers of his newspaper in South Africa. After their first major campaign of resistance where they burned their passes and whatnot in South Africa, publicly, they put steel barrels up in the city of, I think, Pretoria first, and they marched up to the steel barrels and dropped their passes that they had to have in South Africa into the barrel and burned them as an act of civil disobedience and resistance. So those ideas that Gandhi brought to the fore are ancient ideas. I learned my nonviolence from my mother's encounter with me over my use of fighting against folk who used racist epithets against me on the street. But then I discovered that the churches that I grew up in, my dad's parishes, where I learned to sing "Wade in the Water," "Go Down Moses," "Steal Away to Jesus." These are songs out of the great, great, great library of musical literature and liturgy of the Negro spiritual, the Negro black song, across 200 or 300 years. That literature has the insistence in it that you are a human being and a child of God, that you can walk through hell caring for yourself and for others in spite of the hell you're walking through. So the black song, and I've gone through large collected lists of songs, over 8,000 in one place in my library, over 800 remnants of the music and the liturgy of the Negro spiritual. So it was a form of resistance that put the resistance in the place of the heart and the mind and the soul and the behavior. And I maintain that my own nonviolence began in that song, in those songs, and then my mother's encounter with me over my use of violence. And then I met Gandhi in 1947 through his autobiography, and then a number of biographies that were available, many of which I read in 47 to 50, whatever I could get my hands on. So the point I'm wanting to make is that the themes and methodologies are very, very ancient. The first strike, which is a nonviolent tactic, is to be found in 1170 by workers who stopped their labor in Egypt, 1170 BCE, before this era. The first act of civil disobedience that's recorded is in the first chapter of the book of Exodus in the Hebrew Bible, where Pharaoh orders the midwives of the slaves to see to it that every boy baby is stillborn. And they disobey. In fact, that second chapter even names two of the women who committed the civil disobedience against Pharaoh. And they refused to carry out that order. So, the methods, philosophies, theories are ancient. And based on my understanding and my reading and my father and mother on the life of Jesus, I became a follower of Jesus and practiced what I came to call in 1947, having read Gandhi, nonviolent behavior against wrongs, especially against racism. So I do have stories of that as well. So I'm pushing very hard for us to understand that Gandhi was like an Albert Einstein, a Thomas Edison. He did the hard work as a student and as a person of prayer, which he became as a lawyer. He did the hard work that enabled him then to propose. There is a system and theory and a whole history of non-war, non-violence that is not recorded. But much of it is a lot of it is hidden, but a lot of it is available. I'm going to be kind of selfish. I want to give you a concrete experience of it, which is not in our history books. Eastern Pennsylvania was given as a land grant to William Penn by King James or King George, whichever king it was, because William Penn's father was a war hero, a naval hero, and the king wanted to make William Penn, the son, safe. He had become a Quaker, and Quakers were being persecuted because they were seen as strange people in a Roman Catholic and Anglican world. So he gave William Grant Eastern Pennsylvania as a land grant. William Penn did two things. He began to prepare his Quaker people who wanted to leave England for going to eastern Pennsylvania. He found out who were the major Indian chiefs of the Poquoy, I think that's how we pronounce it, Indians in eastern Pennsylvania. He wrote them letters, and he said to them, this land has been given to us, but we know it belongs to you. We are coming anyway, but we're going to come not as your conquerors, we're coming as your neighbors. We're going to treat you as our sisters and brothers. We will live side by side with you, and we want you to be prepared to let us come. Something like that. Those letters are in the archives at Swarthmore and around in many places. I found them in a book in college, 1947-48. The letters to the Indians. For 75 years, the settlers from Great Britain, England, lived at peace with the Indians in eastern Pennsylvania and the Indians with the settlers. None were ever killed. Indian wars were going on, so-called Indian wars were going on in western Pennsylvania, in New York, in Maryland, in Delaware, in New Jersey. 1680 approximately to 1745, 1750. No such thing happening in eastern Pennsylvania. You may now find that in an American history book, but I doubt it. You didn't find it in my day, but it was available in other kinds of books. That's where I learned it. That is a huge experiment by a group of people from England with the Native Americans of eastern Pennsylvania, where they treated each other as colleagues and neighbors and treated each other with decency for 75 years.
Good evening. I currently been reading about the Highland School and Miles Horton. And so I'm very interested in that school system and how it was set up and the women who came through there. And so can you speak about some of the women, because you highlighted your mother as an inspiration in terms of your nonviolence. So what women were involved in the Highland School and their involvement in terms of the nonviolent movement? Yeah, well,
Highland School was organized probably in the late 20s, early 30s of the last century. Initially, well, it was in Tennessee, where it still is in Tennessee. And it was a place that some relatively small number of black folk went to. This has been written up a number of times. I have to say that even though blacks could go to the school, this was a very small affair in Tennessee, though it was vastly persecuted by state government and hated by a number of white people in both Mount Eagle and now outside of Knoxville, though I think some of the hate has declined. I actually do not, I'm not trying to say this to be mean, but I actually do not know of a single person from Highland Folk School who was a nonviolent organizer in what I call the Rosa Parks Martin Luther King movement. I actually do not know of any. In any case, I do know that whatever they taught in terms of pacifism and or nonviolence, it was not what pushed that movement, that campaign. They were a friend, yes indeed. And I visited there as a speaker in the 60s, 58, maybe 59, I do not remember. The nonviolence that emerged through the Montgomery bus boycott was, as Martin King insisted in the initial days, a reflection of the religion of Jesus, a sign of the immense love of God. On the very first night of the bus boycott, which was December the 5th, 1955, Martin was the major speaker, having just been elected president of the new organization that they formed in order to continue the boycott. And King said, among other things, we're not going to try to imitate the racism and the system in which we find ourselves. We're going to do this with Christian love. We're not going to go and drag white people out of their homes and beat up on them. We're not going to go around talking bad about each other. We're not going to burn crosses. That was the KK way of intimidation and harassment and killing. We're not going to burn crosses anywhere in Montgomery. We're going to do this with the dignity of our lives, with the love of our lives. So you can find that speech. It's written. It's in a number of collections of his speeches, so you'll find it. So he started out that way, insisting this is how we fight conflict and disaster. And then later on he said nonviolence. First time he said it that I found is January 30th when his house was bombed. But by that time he had been visited by Bayard Rustin, and Bayard had been encouraged to go to Montgomery from a group of New York nonviolent scholars, practitioners, and by Quakers and the FOR, and so he began translating the boycott into a nonviolent tactic.
Reverend Lawson, I know over the last day and a half we've been talking to you, and I wanted to ask you again a question that I know we've asked you before, and that is, when you were involved in building the Black Freedom Movement along with your colleagues, how did you view the different struggles across the world who took up arms in the search for justice? And how do you make sense of those struggles today in retrospect? And I'm talking about the struggles across Africa. I know. Yeah, I know you get asked this a lot. But I know a young man asked you about Ho Chi Minh also.
Well, I was opposed to the violence. I never told any of them that, including Fidel Castro. Eduardo
Mondelon.
Yeah, Mondelon was a student in the United States in my day. We became friends. He was a Methodist. And he went back to Mozambique and organized the independence movement, and he eventually took on arms. He developed an armed struggle, which he felt he had to. I never criticized Eduardo about it, because I did not live in his situation. Fidel Castro is one of the people I have admired ever since he appeared in the scene. His speeches in Harlem are something to read and hear. He was one of the outstanding, I think, public figures of the 20th century, no matter what we, the people of the USA, may think about him. And no matter U.S. foreign policy, which is disastrous as far as I'm concerned. I visited Kenya in the midst of
Jomo Kenyatta.
Yeah, Jomo Kenyatta, in the midst of that struggle. I read about Africa. I tend not to go into other places and try to criticize what they're doing in their scene. And I do not try to tell people locally where I visit how to do things. But I am absolutely convinced that Western-oriented violence that combines science and technology and violence is one of the major threats to our planet Earth and to human life and to human community. And that the Western paradigm of the power of violence is wrong, and Gandhi and King represents the word of history to the United States that you're wrong and you better change your way of living and working and acting, else you will destroy yourself. King said very clearly, coexistence or co-annihilation. And he's speaking directly in the United States. So I think that we who have remnants of violence in our hearts or in our hands with our children or domestic violence, and I sort of backed away from the peace movement in the United States because my issue was that the violence we need to resist is domestic in the United States. Get rid of that violence and create a different kind of a United States, and then we might help reduce the violence in the earth.
So with that said, in terms of violence and the United States now having so many mass shootings, and no one seems to want to do anything about gun violence, and so...
Because of their love of violence. Because we have an obsession and a kind of a religious worship of the power of violence. When you begin to examine that love, you see the flaws in the violence. If you go look at Iraq, and I've been there, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, Gaza, you go look in Central Asia and see what violence has done. If you take a look at the violence in the United States over the centuries, especially directed against Indians, people of color, black people in particular, the slave, the women. We are a nation that hung women as witches in the 16th century, 1636, 1637, in northern eastern part of the United States, in New England area. We have a vicious business of violence, and we've drunk the poison of violence. If anyone takes a look at that violence at all, you know that something's wrong. It has not encouraged our babies to become mature human beings. It has not encouraged the stability of families and the self-sustaining of the immediate family and the extended family. It's not encouraged the building of a city street and homes. It has not created schools or the nurture of people or hospitals for the healing It has not produced anything that it claims to produce. The wars of America did not produce the modicum of freedom that people of color in this country now experience. I didn't say it was perfect, or that it's gotten far enough yet, and I have not said that we have dismantled enough of the economic orders or the racist orders or the mythologies. I have not said that. I'm simply saying life today in the United States is not what it was in 1940. People of color, or 1960s. So.
Can I ask a question? Thank you, Reverend Lawson. I want to pursue Nanditha's question from a different angle.
Okay.
You know, in Marxist-Leninist theory, there's a theory of the state. And the theory goes that in capitalist societies, the principal legitimate institution of violence is the state, okay? And that to achieve a revolution, the revolutionaries must overthrow the oppressive state and violently dismantle it. Violently dismantle the principal institution of legitimated violence. Now, on the other side, Gandhi argues that through mass action and non-cooperation, you can force the state to collapse. Okay? I think we have two theories of revolutionary change. Gandhi has a theory of how to overturn the oppressive state, in his case, the colonial state. Lenin has a theory of how to overthrow the state, in his case, the czarist regime in his nation. Now, I don't see any reconciliation of the two positions, number one. But number two, at a certain level, the Marxist theory, be it in the anti-colonial struggle, as for example, Mozambique, or Vietnam, or Cuba, the state has to be violently dismantled. As they say, it must be smashed. I think, and I'll end here, I think for large numbers throughout the world of revolutionaries, this is a very compelling, in fact, more plausible theory of revolutionary change than the Gandhian approach to nonviolence, ahimsa or satyagraha. I'd like to hear your response to it.
Okay. Yeah. And I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I appreciate very much what you've said, what you're saying. And it seems to me that this is one of the reasons why I think that Marxist and Leninist definitions of revolution are wrong, or need to be modified. At least in the 20th century, many of the forms of violence that have been used in the wars, let's say from 1900 on to the present moment, have so brutalized life that it has become far more complicated then for people to rebuild, and to rebuild with humanistic efforts and the rest of it. In addition to that, I would say that revolution is not primarily violent. Learning is revolution. We speak of revolution in the arts and in music in the United States and elsewhere. There is an ongoing transformation taking place in Christianity, with the great numbers of us who know that religious spirit is not dogma and superiority, but compassion and gentleness in the world. The kind of nonviolence that I've seen practiced in the United States, especially through the Rosa Parks King dimension of what's called the Civil Rights Movement, which I said earlier today, I think has racist connotations in it, as it's used in American singing, is that, let's say, take a Nashville, that revolutionary change has to be done in any case incrementally, whether you're tearing down or building up. And one of the things I taught across the country and across the southeastern part of the country, rather, in city after city, was that if we want to do a violent revolution, I'll go with you, I'll do it. But I knew in high school and college that guerrilla warfare had to build the military sources and resources that could beat the enemy. And there are any number of contemporary social scientists who maintain that if you're going to have a violent revolution, and the way I put it in Nashville or in Baton Rouge was, if we do this, we have to have the resources to beat the local police. We have to have the resources to beat the state police and the National Guard. And we have to have the resources, therefore, we have to escalate the power of our movement violently in such a way that we could beat the U.S. Marines. Because if you're going to beat an enemy with violence who has violent means, you'd better be able to build and escalate the resources on your side that can do it. Even Jesus said, 2,000 years ago, a king wants to go to war against a neighbor king, but he thinks the second thought of it when he recognizes that he's only able to muster 10,000 troops, and the neighbor king has 20,000 troops. Now that's in the Bible, that's in the teaching of Jesus as a parable. So, nonviolence is rooted in power. In a segregated city like Nashville, just one illustration, the powers that be, the powers that were, promoted gentrification and segregation. They still are promoting gentrification. But what we did to begin the nonviolent dismantling of segregation was that we organized in such a way, and we did not have the masses. I would suggest to you in Nashville, had some of us taken the notion of our campaign to the black community for voting, we would have been severely voted down. And conventional leadership in the Nashville black community, which was about 20% of the population of Nashville at that time, would have said, you're going to trouble the waters too much. You're going to upset the balance that we have in Nashville, because that's what conventional leadership does. So it was a relatively small group of us who made the decision to desegregate Nashville downtown through nonviolent action. And what that did was, by sit-ins and an economic boycott and picket lines and mass meetings and constant talking to people, we were able to mobilize the kind of action that put on the table in Nashville another segment of power, which is one of the differences between the pacifist philosophy and the nonviolent philosophy. We do not pretend that we're not trying to engender power. We think that power is, in the words of Aristotle, the person who's called the father of philosophy, Aristotle defined power as the capacity to perform purpose. I think those were his words. The capacity to perform purpose. That is, the ability to effect change, little bits and pieces, to perform work, to make a difference in your own life and other lives. So power is a given of the universe in my mind. In Nashville, the power of direct action with the openness to negotiation and to change and the conversation put a power on the public agenda that was in direct conflict with the power of segregation. And that movement, therefore, changed the public debate and discussion, though that was hard and difficult, met the violence with nonviolent spirituality and power, so that the opposition could not run over us or stop us. And the net result was then that the merchants and the city had to begin to deal with the issues we were raising and negotiated eventually to pulling the white-colored signs down, and later on opening up for jobs for black people in places where we wanted to work, where we shopped and could not clerk or could not handle the money. And a whole series of conversations that brought at least a modicum of change to the city. The change is not complete, as it's not in the United States, but it is, in my mind, it's a third or fourth way of looking at nonviolence and power, nonviolence and conflict, nonviolence and injustice. And the other value of it, there are many values of it, the other value is that we do what Fidel Castro wanted to do. Fidel Castro did not want to kill the people in Cuba who opposed him and differed with him, so he did create educational camps to try to see if he can move them to move from their old position to new positions. So nonviolence means that you don't kill off the enemy, which would only multiply the enemies. You treat them as dignity as you want to be treated, and you can get changes done. And I don't see how, for an example, in the United States today, some people talk civil war. I do not see how anybody in their right mind thinks that our killing each other would help us change this government. But I think there are a slew of nonviolent campaigns that can be waged that will make this nation continue to move towards dismantling the wrong and finding the space to lift up new ways of living together. That's too long a statement.
We'll open it up to everybody to ask questions.
I just wanted to follow up on some of the points that you brought up and relate them back to the question of science, particularly sociology, because Dr. King was trained in sociology, and Gandhi, from what I'm hearing, is he was scientific in his...
Well, he says he established a
science of love.
Right. That's what he writes.
And so it's you know, in his spiritual message to the world, he says, you know, if you go to a village in Mysore and you ask a villager, who rules the village? The villager will say some god. But his point is that some mysterious power governs the universe, and people have a sense that they're being governed, but how do we change? I don't have the words, but harnessing that sense of their faith. And he says faith itself cannot be proven by extraneous evidence. So the best course of action is to believe in the moral government of the world. And so I was just reminded of that when you were speaking. And this question of science, and that do we even know what science is anymore? Because we've been studying war, like the spiritual, study war no more.
Well, I think science does have a lot to say and a lot to contribute. I mean, I think, for example, that in 1947 I took astronomy, and at that time the world of astronomy said that the universe is compacting, and that we will one day know the limits of the universe. Well, the technology that has been adopted in astronomy, radio, telescopes, spaceships, astronomy now knows that the universe is limitless, that you cannot imagine the universe, it's beyond our imagination. We have two spaceships, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, that began around 1979, and they're now in what they call the interspace region of space. That means it's gone beyond what they thought was the limits of our universe. And they're still flying, they're still out there. So science has marvelous offerings to how we can enhance our knowledge, our self-knowledge, and our lives. I have a running quarrel with someone I do watch on television as often as I find myself in the right place. And that's Bill Maher, who calls himself an atheist and likes to quarrel with religion, but he never brings a Martin Luther King Jr. on his show. He never brings a pastor like a William Sloane Coffin, who could match in piece with piece. Atheism is a new religion. The ancient world almost unanimously understood a million years ago, 700,000 years ago, the ancient human beings knew that they had not put themselves on the earth, and that they had not created the heavens or the earth. And they almost universally, in different ways, said that there is a God or goddesses or gods and goddesses, said that there is a spirit that we can't know and is ineffable and unnameable, but that there is an energy somewhere that has made the earth and the heavens and put us here. So atheism is a new faith, new mythology. Now I haven't answered that question, but so I think we learn, and we have to learn. And I guess I want to say that in the Western world, we must unlearn our hatreds and our violences. Unlearn the structures that hurt and maim. We must unlearn them and find then creative ways of replacing them.
Reverend Lawson, I thought I would ask a follow-up question to something you mentioned about your activity in Nashville. What struck me was that you said when you thought about or as you processed the challenge of desegregating downtown Nashville, you and your group realized that the masses were not with you, and therefore that you had to act with a group that was smaller than the masses of Black people within Nashville. I think about that as potentially a contrast to the Rosa Parks movement in Montgomery. And what I think inspires a lot of people about Montgomery in 1955 is that, at least the way we learn about it, it was a sort of a movement by the masses. And so, a movement by the masses in terms of getting a common agreement among African American people in Montgomery to take a certain action of nonviolence. And so I was hoping that you could reflect on the process of revolution when it involves a small group of people, when it involves engagement of the masses, and how you figure out how to prioritize as you work on the issues that you work on.
Well, it became a movement of 40 to 50,000 Black people, but it was provoked and led by and directed by a handful of people. Rosa Parks, Louise West, Annie Carr, Mary Jo Robinson, especially Mary Jo Robinson, were all women who, as early as 1953, were negotiating with the bus company in the city of Montgomery and saying to them, among other things, that if you do not change the misbehavior of the bus company, we're going to push a boycott. They used the term boycott in their letters and in their conversations. So when Rosa Parks was arrested on December 1st in the afternoon or early evening, Mary Jo Robinson, who was then president of the Women's Political Council, which was a relatively small group of women who met to talk public issues, grabbed a number of her people, went into the basement of a Alabama State A&M building and mimeographed thousands of sheets saying there's going to be a boycott on Monday. This was before anyone else had suggested it. And they bundled these up into packages of 100. I think they printed maybe as many as 15,000 or 30,000, something like that, all night long, Friday night. Then on Saturday, they took them to bars, nightclubs, funeral homes, congregations, all sorts of local agencies. They put them in Black stores and whatnot, calling for the boycott Monday morning. Other people of their group were calling Martin King. Ed Nixon was calling ministers, and many phone calls. So, yes, the 40, 50,000 Black people got off the buses, and many of them walked for 381 days, but there were already a small group of folk in Birmingham who were convinced that Montgomery would not change unless they adopted tactics of nonviolent struggle. Now, that's the larger story of Montgomery. So it wasn't the masses who moved. If the masses had been asked, they may have thought it would be too difficult. I have been pushing nonviolent struggle since the late 1940s, early 50s. And I've had all kinds of people in all kinds of meetings tell me it could never happen. But I was convinced by 1992 we Black people were going to have such a movement, and I knew I was going to be a part of it. By 1950, I knew this was going to happen. I did not know where or when or who, but I was convinced that we would have a black movement in this country that would indeed begin to oppose vigorously the assault of racism and segregation and Jim Crow law in practice, custom law, and ideologies. I knew that by 1952. So, but lots of people told me I was out of my mind.
I got a question for you. I would like to know, how do you plan to stop American global military hegemony, who have over 1,500 bases throughout the world? How do you plan to stop them from doing that? The minute you have you got bases in 1,500 different countries, you make the people there subservient.
Oh, yeah. No doubt.
So how do you plan to dismantle that?
Yeah, okay, you will not like my answer. I maintain that powers that be in the United States deliberately assassinated Martin Luther King Jr. because our movement was only maybe 10 years old. None of us knew what we were doing. None of us had mastered sufficiently the business of organizing and effecting a strategic campaign that we knew even yet how to do it. The assassination of King, along with the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy and Malcolm X and Medgar Evers also, I think, these assassinations changed the history of the United States forever. You have to understand that. And at least 3 of those assassinations, there are signs that they went into high circles of military and civilian government in Washington, D.C.
Called a military-industrial complex.
Well, that's one name for it. But in the case of Martin Luther King Jr., I kept on helping to assist the independent investigations of assassination of Martin, my leader and my brother. And I know that that was assassination planned in high circles. We know from documented evidence in at least 5 books. I just read a book by a Tennessean scientist on the killing of Martin Luther King, where he says, with beyond a shadow of doubt, he rehearses the case against James Earl Ray, and then rehearses where that case was felonious. And James Earl Ray was the patsy chosen probably by the CIA and given CIA money to finance himself the last year of his life, the last year of King's life. So I know that case. That case was assassination by public disorder in the United States. It included at least the FBI. It probably included some military intelligence. We know it included the local police. The marksman, the names of the marksmen, the 2 possible marksmen have been printed in the book Orders to Kill by William Pepper, a lawyer who became the last lawyer of James Earl Ray. So I know that case. And it was a very smooth case. And I suspect the Kennedy assassination, and I suspect that Robert F. Kennedy, Malcolm X knew he was being followed by FBI. He heard some of the phone calls. And there is a group of activists who have those tapes that they're trying to create a film on Malcolm X and Martin King to show that Malcolm X had transformed his life and was moving towards joining with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and Martin King in common action. The last phone calls of both of them indicate that. So we know in those implicated. We know the military intelligence was in Memphis on April the 4th, 1967, at the time of the assassination. And William Pepper, who's written at least 3 books now on this, because he was the last independent investigator that sort of concluded the investigation of the King assassination. We know from him that there were probably, that the military intelligence teams that were in Memphis probably took a slew of pictures that might reveal even where the assassin was, where the shooting happened. They were on a tall building in Memphis taking shots of Memphis on that day. A military intelligence unit. I've forgotten the number, but it's written form, so you can look it up. So this is one of the reasons I maintain that even as the last Civil War only kept the contiguous states together but did not solve the problems, that another Civil War will not solve the problems, no matter. And nearly 700,000 people died in that Civil War.
I'm not talking about
So
civil.
your question is, how do we fight the hundreds of military bases? Well,
That the United States have.
yes, in every continent. I think the way to do it is to organize the nonviolent campaigns in the United States to such an extent that a national movement will forge the budgets for the people that will cause the ending of our military occupation of the world. I do not think that we, the American people, can challenge the military bases and installations that we have in 43 countries in Africa. We can cut their budgets and bring them home. Okay? Okay, so you're like those who in Tennessee and elsewhere thought that the bus boycott was useless and that planning such things would not work.
I'm not talking about here. I'm talking about in other countries.
Yeah, well,
1,500 throughout the world.
that is, you will not hear that in any political campaign in the United States, although Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard has brought it up. It is rarely discussed in presidential elections, but that represents the aggression of the United States domestic and international policy that we have over military bases. So I maintain we have to change the very nature of how we politic in the United States. And the King Parks movement was on the way to becoming one such dimension of that struggle. It was on its way to making that happen. And the death of King, therefore, allowed disastrous things to occur in the black community. I don't have a great man theory, but I do believe that there are across human history and across ordinary communities. I mean, I know a lot of the hard-working people in Los Angeles, for example, in Nashville and Memphis, where I've spent my life working. Leadership emerges through the hard work and the willingness of people to stand with the issues that most hurt their communities.
Good evening. The line, yesterday evening when we had dinner, there was a striking comment. You tell your youth when you have a class when you're teaching university. I was kind of hoping that you could, re-answer that question of, what you would say to young people that would that would spark that interest in nonviolence.
Hi, Reverend Lawson. Oh gosh. My question is actually related to Jake's in a way, because I feel like a lot of young people these days don't believe in truth beyond mere scientific fact. Like they don't believe in any sort of deeper, like essential, indivisible truth. And so I was wondering how you would respond to or relate to young people who don't believe in truth. And then I had a second question that came to mind from what you were talking about with the movement. And I was just curious what leadership means to you.
Well, I did say earlier that atheism and non-belief in a power beyond ourselves and the universe is really relatively new to the human family. Almost all the ancient peoples of 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 or more years ago believed that there was a power that created the universe. They didn't say it that way, but they believed that there was a power beyond themselves. And so the whole religious world is very, very full of the myths and stories of creation across the human family, way, way back, including our own Indian tribes of this country that have creative stories about creation that insist to them that there's something beyond ourselves. They spoke of the Great Spirit, and they spoke of the spirit world, and they spoke of Indian chief Tecumseh of Ohio, Indiana, called the source of life, the master of life. That was his term. I like that term too. So the non-belief in the mystery of the universe, the hiddenness of the universe, the spirit behind our lives, the sense that that's not the case is a new human reality. And where that idea is in the scientific world or elsewhere, where that's going to lead the human race will be, I would think, an extraordinary journey to be able to follow. I don't expect to be able to follow it, but I think that should be very interesting. Because religion makes a mess of lots of things. I mean, I maintain that. I say that about Christianity, which I know best. And much of that form of Christianity is very powerful politically in the United States, but it is a disaster, and it is not the religion of Jesus. And I can say that boldly. So how do you do this with young people? Well, the places where I've been able to be most effective, I know this, is when the teaching and the work goes on with a very practical problem you're trying to resolve. Like racism and segregation, like the national story. There were students who came to the workshops on nonviolence, which I led and directed, who of course did not believe. They grew up in America. They grew up in a world where violence was seen as the greatest power for change or for self-defense. So they did not, but as we were working, but we were working for a concrete purpose. The preparation of those workshops was for the purpose of creating a struggle in Nashville itself. And we were planning to use the sit-in. I had strategized the movement. We were planning to use the economic boycott. We were planning to use the mass meeting. We were planning to use pickup lines. So I had those 4 methods and tactics laid out for the development of our campaign before the workshops even began. So we were able, some people stayed because we were going to do something about the segregation of the city. So because there was a concrete project in mind, they went through the workshops. But a number of names that you know came out of that experience. But that experience of learning and teaching and changing was because we had something we thought needed to be done, and we were going to do it with nonviolent strategy and theory. And it was very, very effective. So the best way of teaching students and young people the nonviolent way is to try to create purpose for the program, purpose for the effort. And it does work. One of the thrills I have in life right now is meeting the people in Los Angeles, where back in the 80s I started working with unions on nonviolent theory, tactics, and practice. And where therefore Los Angeles has become the second dense union city in the nation, next to New York City. We have now over 800,000 people who belong to unions. And this was large measure done through workshops in which I taught at length with one of the unions, and that has taken hold to make LA a dynamic city of organized labor, which I think is essential for a democracy, for a healthy society. Working people have to have their voices and use those voices with wisdom. Does that come close to, and so one of my great thrills today is to be at UCLA and to go to the various kind of community meetings where I meet some of these persons who are in the labor movement, or out of the labor movement now, but who participated in some of these struggles that we have had across that 30-year period. So I'm not a labor union leader, and I'm not a civil rights worker. I'm a pastor who feels very strongly that the teachings of Jesus, also now the teachings of Gandhi, are critical things that if we human beings learn them, we will improve our lives. Martin King said that Jesus has provided the spirit and Gandhi has provided the methodology.
I just had a quick question going back to the bases in the war. How it seems to me that Dr. King was a Pan-Africanist, and when he went to Ghana, for example, Kwame Nkrumah had used Gandhi's method.
Called it positive action.
Absolutely.
He renamed it.
And so positive action program.
Yeah.
So in many ways, the answer is already there, because this was a movement that opposed the creation of, well, at that point, the British Empire and the military and the European empires throughout Africa. So it was a Pan-African movement. So I guess my question is, how did Pan-Africanism, which was Du Boisian Pan-Africanism, especially, come together with nonviolence at this time?
I don't think that has happened.
I just think of Ghana and South Africa and India, and what Du Bois talked about, the unity of Pan-Africa and Pan-Asia in the anti-imperialist movement.
I don't use the term global. I have a globe on my desk, and it's pure glass. It doesn't think or feel or whatnot. So I think global is a bad term, and I think global is meant also to get us in the fight against racism. Let me just use that as an example. To say, well, it's a worldwide problem. And to get people to think that the problem is so big that they cannot do anything where they are. Every worldwide problem is fundamentally a local problem. And my nonviolence tells me that the place to work is where I live and work and play. So that I maintain, therefore, that nonviolence is primarily not rooted in the global, but in the places where people live. That if we can change effectively the places where we live, then we'll have one day a global movement. But the global movement is not going to come first. Huh? I don't think the global movement's going to. The UN is a good effort to get a lot of things done and to bring about a commonality of purpose and understanding among the nations of the earth. But the UN is vigorously fought by the United States that wants to control it, vigorously financed and managed in some way by Western civilization, including Russia. So while it has many good themes and gatherings and work, a lot of good works that will multiply, hopefully, and it's an important thing. It has to be built upon, but it has to be strengthened by local. It has to be strengthened by local campaigns that so reshape the thinking of the nations and the peoples of the earth that it can move towards becoming a powerful influence among us in the world. So that is my theme. Nonviolence, I think, requires two things right now in the United States. Dismantling the old structures, the old ideologies, customs, and practices, and then allowing space for the discovery of new ways of our living together. The free market system has to be dismantled. Has to be dismantled. And any resistance in the United States has to find some ways of doing that. The police system has to be dismantled. It's rooted in violence. It's not rooted in democracy. It's not rooted in the community. It's not rooted in the building and constructing of creative communities where lawlessness becomes a minority perspective entirely. And that's the work we have to do, from my mind.
You're saying so many powerful things. My thought is, you said you had some possible strategies or ideas in terms of things that we could do now. And coming up as an election year, what is maybe a tool or strategy for mobilizing not just the youth, but all of us in community? Because voting is one of the strongest things we can do, and particularly in this election, we need to make a change. So as a strategist, what would you offer to the community to mobilize us?
Well, voting, of course, is one of the nonviolent methods that's listed by the scholar Gene Sharp in the Tactics and Methods of Nonviolence. Voting is one of the 198 tactics, methods that he lists that have been used by people across the face of the earth. I think that voting becomes a powerful instrument only when we, the citizens, are engaged and awakened citizens. And we already know how elections can be won. Obama has shown us that. Lyndon Johnson did it. Jimmy Carter did it. I think that we have to put pressure on Democratic elected officials and on Democratic Party leadership to become a party for truth and justice, to become a party for the people of this country. Since the 1970s, at least, the Democratic Party tries to move centrist ideas and leftist ideas and rightist ideas is a way of smothering a good conversation about public life and about human beings. We human beings have more options than that can be placed in three kind of categories. On the issue of the serial killings that now take place about once a week, most of them are not written up so that we can read it or not reported on television. Well, centrist, leftist, rightist doesn't mean anything. In my judgment, this is the kind of issue that you have to de-escalate the killing. You have to stop it. And you can stop it by putting armed forces all around the country, beefing up the police with all sorts of military tactics, make certain the police are in every home, every school, every theater, every shopping mall, every market. That's the approach we're taking. And that's what is failing because this increases. And so I would primarily try to suggest that there are nonviolent options, and there are options that we do not necessarily call nonviolence, but which this society has used in the past. After all, the killing of 4 or more people every week was not happening in the 1960s or the 1930s. There were lynchings, police brutality, absolutely, but this did not take place at the rate of 40 every week. Also, in the 40s and 30s, 5 women were not being killed every day by ex-husbands or husbands by boyfriends or ex-boyfriends, as the Justice Department reported back a couple of years ago. So no one is asking, well, how do we back away from these killings? Well, I think there are lots of ways that can be done, but the heart of our nation is that violence is the major. Violence is to us a kind of God. We worship the god Mars. Thus our hundreds of military bases outside the country. Thus our $1.5 trillion of money for our military every 2 years. Every 2 years we spend about $1 trillion and $1/3 trillion, $1.300 million rather every year. Every 2 years we spend maybe close to $3 trillion on just the military budget alone. it has not made our country a better country at all. So I say to you that we have to try some creative love, creative.
Okay, everybody, I think it's getting late, and I'd like to thank Reverend Lawson once again.
Delighted I'm in Philadelphia and had a chance to be here. I know that I'm pleased I'll be taking many of you across the months and years ahead. And you encourage me very much. I appreciate it.
I'd like to thank you all also for joining us today to celebrate the 150th birth anniversary of Gandhi. And I hope that you got something from the day's events and that you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Tony, I appreciate the way you put that question.
Are you thinking of getting it from there? No, I got there Saturday. Yeah, I got it from
that right?
Yeah, it didn't work.